When Sarah Mitchell boarded Flight 847 for what was supposed to be a relaxing spring break vacation to Hawaii, she never imagined that within 3 hours, she'd be the only person standing between 312 passengers and certain death, forced to become an improvised air traffic controller while soaring at 35,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean. What started as a much-needed escape from her demanding job as a high school physics teacher in Portland would transform into the most terrifying and heroic 8 hours of her life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah had been looking forward to this trip for months. After a brutal semester dealing with budget cuts, overcrowded classrooms, and the endless pressure of standardized testing, she desperately needed time away from the classroom. At 34, she felt burned out despite her passion for teaching. The stress was taking its toll: sleepless nights, spent grading papers, weekend tutoring sessions, and the constant worry about whether she was truly making a difference in her students' lives. This Hawaiian vacation wasn't just a luxury, it was a necessity for her mental health. As she settled into seat 23B, Sarah noticed the usual mix of travelers around her. Families excited about their tropical getaway, business travelers already buried in their laptops, and fellow teachers who, like herself, had waited for spring break to finally take a breath. She pulled out her tablet, loaded with the latest physics journals she'd been meaning to read, alongside a few mindless romance novels, the perfect balance of intellectual stimulation and complete brain shutdown she craved. The flight crew seemed professional and experienced. Captain Rodriguez had introduced himself over the intercom with the kind of confident, calming voice that immediately put passengers at ease. He mentioned his 23 years of flying experience and promised a smooth flight to Honolulu. First Officer Chen had walked through the cabin earlier, chatting with passengers and checking on families with small children. The 3 flight attendants moved through their pre-flight routine with practiced efficiency. Everything seemed perfectly normal for what should have been a routine 5-hour flight. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah had always been fascinated by aviation, though few people knew about this interest. During graduate school, while pursuing her master's in education, she had taken several aerospace engineering courses as electives. Her undergraduate degree in physics had given her a solid foundation in understanding the principles of flight, navigation systems, and even basic air traffic control procedures. It was knowledge she'd never expected to use outside of answering the occasional student question about how airplanes work. She had even considered pursuing a career in aerospace before ultimately choosing education, drawn by the idea of inspiring the next generation of scientists and engineers. As the Boeing 777 lifted off from Portland International Airport, Sarah felt the familiar mixture of excitement and slight nervousness that always accompanied takeoff. She watched the ground fall away below, the familiar landmarks of her city shrinking to miniature size. The Columbia River looked like a silver ribbon, Mount Hood appeared as a distant white peak, and soon they were climbing through the cloud layer into brilliant sunshine above. The physics teacher in her marveled at the incredible engineering that made this routine miracle possible, hundreds of tons of metal and people defying gravity through the careful application of aerodynamic principles. The first hour of the flight passed without incident. Sarah had dozed off briefly, lulled by the steady drone of the engines and the gentle vibration of the aircraft. She woke as the flight attendants began their beverage service, gratefully accepting a coffee and declining the offered snacks. Around her, passengers were settling into their various activities, some watching movies on their devices, others working on laptops, children playing games, and a few like herself simply gazing out the window at the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean stretching endlessly below. It was during the second hour that Sarah first noticed something was wrong. As someone who had flown frequently for educational conferences, she had developed an intuitive sense for the normal rhythms and sounds of air travel. The subtle change in engine pitch caught her attention first, not dramatic enough for most passengers to notice, but distinct enough to make her look up from her reading. Then she noticed the flight attendants huddled in conversation near the galley, their expressions serious and concerned. One of them kept glancing toward the cockpit door with an expression Sarah couldn't quite read. The captain's voice came over the intercom, but this time the confidence from earlier seemed forced. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some minor technical difficulties that require our attention. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened while we work through our procedures. We'll have an update for you shortly. The message was reassuring on the surface, but Sarah detected an underlying tension that made her stomach tighten with anxiety. What Sarah didn't know yet was that the minor technical difficulties were anything but minor. In the cockpit, Captain Rodriguez and First Officer Chen were dealing with a cascading series of system failures that had begun with what appeared to be a simple communication glitch. Their primary and backup radio systems had failed simultaneously, cutting them off from air traffic control. Then the navigation systems began showing conflicting information, and now warning lights were illuminating across multiple panels. Most critically, they had lost contact with their airline's operations center and had no way to communicate their situation to anyone on the ground. What Captain Rodriguez and First Officer Chen were facing in the cockpit was every pilot's nightmare scenario, a perfect storm of technological failures that seemed to defy statistical probability. The primary VHF radio had failed first, followed within minutes by the backup system. The transponder, which allows air traffic control to track the aircraft, had gone dark. Even the satellite communication system that provided data links to their airline's operations center had mysteriously stopped functioning. For the first time in his 23-year career, Captain Rodriguez found himself completely cut off from the outside world while flying a fully loaded passenger aircraft over the Pacific Ocean. The navigation systems were providing conflicting information that made no sense. The GPS showed one position, the inertial navigation system indicated another location entirely, and the backup compass seemed to be spinning slowly but continuously. First Officer Chen had never seen anything like it in her 8 years of flying. She methodically worked through the emergency checklists, but none of the standard procedures addressed a simultaneous failure of this magnitude. The aircraft's flight management computer, which normally handled most of the navigation automatically, was displaying error messages and refusing to accept manual inputs. Meanwhile, the warning lights were telling a story of progressive system degradation. The electrical system indicators showed fluctuating power levels despite normal generator function. The hydraulic pressure readings were gradually declining, which would eventually affect their ability to control the aircraft's flight surfaces. Most concerning of all, the engine monitoring systems were beginning to show subtle but persistent anomalies that suggested potential fuel system problems. Captain Rodriguez realized they might be dealing with some kind of electromagnetic interference, or even a coordinated cyber attack on the aircraft systems. Sarah was not the only passenger who noticed that something was seriously wrong. The flight attendant's attempts to maintain normal service were becoming increasingly strained. Passengers in the forward section of the cabin could hear muffled conversations and what sounded like urgent radio calls from the cockpit area. The usual sounds of electronic beeping and chiming that occasionally emanated from the flight deck had been replaced by an ominous silence, broken only by hushed urgent voices. Dr. James Harrison, a retired air traffic controller sitting in first class, had been monitoring the flight's progress on his aviation tracking app when the aircraft's signals simply disappeared from his screen. As someone who had spent 35 years guiding an aircraft safely through some of the busiest airspace in the world, he immediately understood the implications. Aircraft don't just vanish from tracking systems during routine flights. He quietly unbuckled his seatbelt and made his way toward the front of the cabin, hoping to offer his expertise to the flight crew. Sarah noticed Dr. Harrison's movement and the concerned expression on his face. As a teacher, she had developed an acute ability to read people's emotions and body language, skills that served her well in managing classroom dynamics. The elderly gentleman's purposeful movement toward the cockpit, combined with his obvious aviation knowledge, based on the technical magazines he'd been reading, suggested that he understood something about their situation that other passengers didn't. The aircraft's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. Subtle course corrections that should have been imperceptible to passengers were now noticeable as gentle banking maneuvers. The autopilot system was struggling to maintain stable flight as it received conflicting information from various sensors. Captain Rodriguez had taken manual control of the aircraft, but flying by visual reference alone over the vast Pacific Ocean, with no radio contact and unreliable instruments, was pushing his skills to their absolute limit. In the cabin, passengers were beginning to notice the unusual flight patterns. Conversations gradually died down as people became aware of the subtle but persistent changes in the air. Children, who had been playing happily, began to sense the adults' growing anxiety. The flight attendants were no longer maintaining their professional smiles, instead moving through the cabin with expressions of barely controlled concern. Sarah found herself thinking about her students back in Portland. She had always taught them that physics was about understanding and predicting the behavior of the natural world, about finding order and logic in apparent chaos. Now, thousands of feet above the ocean, she was confronting a situation where the normal rules seemed to have been suspended. The aircraft that should have been following predictable physical laws was behaving in ways that defied explanation. The realization hit her gradually but with growing certainty: they were in serious trouble. Whatever was happening in the cockpit was beyond the scope of routine mechanical problems. The systematic failure of multiple independent systems suggested something far more serious than a simple equipment malfunction. As a physics teacher who had studied electromagnetic phenomena extensively, Sarah began to wonder if they might be experiencing some kind of unprecedented interference pattern that was disrupting the aircraft's electronic systems. Dr. Harrison had reached the forward galley and was speaking in low, urgent tones with the senior flight attendant. Sarah could see the woman's face pale as she listened to whatever the retired air traffic controller was telling her. After a brief conversation, the flight attendant knocked on the cockpit door and was quickly admitted. The door closed behind her, but not before Sarah caught a glimpse of the intense activity and concern visible on the flight deck. The next announcement from Captain Rodriguez confirmed everyone's worst fears. His voice, while still professionally controlled, carried an unmistakable note of urgency. Ladies and gentlemen, we are currently experiencing significant technical difficulties that have affected our communication and navigation systems. We are working diligently to resolve these issues, but we need to prepare for the possibility of an emergency landing. Please listen carefully to your flight attendants as they review emergency procedures. The word emergency sent a wave of panic through the cabin that was almost palpable. Passengers who had been trying to remain calm despite the increasingly obvious problems now faced the reality that their lives might be in danger. Parents clutched their children closer, business travelers abandoned their laptops to focus on the flight attendant's safety demonstration, and the general murmur of concerned conversation grew louder, despite attempts to maintain composure. Sarah felt her heart racing, but her mind was surprisingly clear. Years of managing classroom crises, from fire drills to lockdown procedures, had taught her to think analytically even under pressure. She found herself automatically categorizing the problems they were facing and considering potential solutions, the same methodical approach she used when helping students work through complex physics problems. The systematic failure of communication and navigation systems suggested a common cause, possibly electromagnetic interference or a coordinated attack on the aircraft's electronic infrastructure. As the flight attendants moved through the cabin demonstrating emergency procedures with practiced efficiency despite their obvious concern, Sarah noticed Dr. Harrison returning to his seat with a grim expression. Their eyes met across the cabin, and she saw in his face the confirmation of her worst suspicions. As a retired air traffic controller, he would understand better than anyone the gravity of their situation. An aircraft without communication or reliable navigation over the Pacific Ocean was essentially flying blind into one of the most dangerous environments on Earth. The senior flight attendant, whose name tag read Jennifer, approached Dr. Harrison's row and spoke with him quietly for several minutes. Sarah could see them discussing something intently, with Jennifer occasionally glancing back toward the cockpit door. Whatever they were discussing seemed to involve serious decision-making, and Sarah found herself straining to catch fragments of their conversation. It was then that Jennifer approached Sarah's row. "Excuse me, are you Dr. Sarah Mitchell?" she asked, checking something on a passenger manifest. Sarah nodded, confused about why she was being singled out. "Dr. Harrison mentioned that you might have relevant technical knowledge that could be helpful in our current situation. Would you be willing to speak with the flight crew?" Sarah's mind raced. How could Dr. Harrison know about her background? Then she remembered filling out her frequent flyer profile years ago, which included her educational background and professional credentials. As someone who regularly traveled to physics conferences, she had listed her advanced degrees in teaching specialization. Dr. Harrison must have somehow accessed or remembered this information and identified her as someone with potentially useful knowledge. "I'm not sure how I could help," Sarah replied honestly. "I'm a high school physics teacher, not an aviation professional." But even as she said it, she was thinking about her graduate coursework in aerospace engineering, her understanding of electromagnetic systems, and her knowledge of navigation principles. While she had never worked in aviation professionally, she had a solid theoretical foundation that might be relevant to their current crisis. Jennifer's expression was desperate but hopeful. "Dr. Harrison believes that your background in physics and your coursework in aerospace engineering could be valuable in understanding what's happening to our systems. The pilots are dealing with multiple simultaneous failures that don't follow any known pattern. We need someone who can think outside the box and perhaps identify connections that our standard procedures don't address." The request was both flattering and terrifying. Sarah realized that in the next few minutes, she might be asked to apply her theoretical knowledge in a life-or-death situation involving hundreds of people. The physics principles she taught in the classroom, electromagnetic theory, navigation systems, and aerodynamic forces, were about to be tested in the most consequential way possible. As she unbuckled her seatbelt and followed Jennifer toward the cockpit, Sarah's mind began organizing everything she knew about aircraft systems and the possible causes of widespread electronic failure. Solar flares could disrupt communication systems, but typically wouldn't affect multiple independent backup systems simultaneously. Electromagnetic pulse weapons were theoretically possible, but seemed unlikely over the Pacific Ocean. The most probable explanation was some kind of sophisticated cyber attack targeting the aircraft's integrated computer systems. The cockpit door opened to reveal a scene of controlled chaos. Captain Rodriguez and First Officer Chen were working systematically through emergency checklists, while Dr. Harrison stood behind them, offering suggestions based on his air traffic control experience. The instrument panels showed a confusing array of warning lights, error messages, and conflicting readings that painted a picture of cascading system failures. "Dr. Mitchell," Captain Rodriguez said without looking up from his instruments, "Dr. Harrison tells us you have a background in electromagnetic systems and we're dealing with failures that seem to defy our standard understanding of aircraft system redundancy. Everything started going wrong simultaneously about 90 minutes ago, and it's getting progressively worse." Sarah moved closer to examine the instrument displays, her mind automatically beginning to analyze the patterns of failure. What she saw was indeed unprecedented, multiple independent systems showing degraded performance in ways that suggested a common underlying cause. The GPS receivers were providing wildly inconsistent position data. The VHF radios were producing only static despite clear weather conditions, and even the backup mechanical instruments were showing subtle but persistent anomalies. "Has anyone considered the possibility of a coordinated electronic attack?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "What you're describing sounds like someone or something is systematically disrupting your electronic systems using sophisticated interference techniques. The question is whether this is targeted specifically at affecting a broader area of airspace." Captain Rodriguez looked at her with new respect. "That's exactly what we've been wondering, but we have no way to verify it without communication with other aircraft or ground control. We're completely isolated up here flying on basic instruments and visual navigation over open ocean." The cockpit felt impossibly small with 4 additional people crowded into the space normally occupied by just the 2 pilots. Sarah found herself wedged between the center console and the captain's seat, trying to make sense of the bewildering array of malfunctioning instruments while staying out of the way of the flight crew's essential work. Every surface seemed to display warning lights, error messages, or readings that made no logical sense according to the laws of physics and engineering she understood. Dr. Harrison was explaining to Captain Rodriguez what he had observed from his tracking app before boarding. Your aircraft disappeared from civilian tracking systems approximately 20 minutes before the problems began manifesting in the cockpit, he said, his voice grim with the implications. That suggests the attack, if that's what this is, began with your transponder and external communication systems before moving into the internal aircraft systems. Sarah absorbed this information while studying the navigation display. The GPS receivers were not just providing inaccurate position data, they were showing positions that changed erratically, sometimes indicating they were over land masses that didn't exist, other times suggesting they were flying at impossible altitudes below sea level. The inertial navigation system, which should have been immune to external electronic interference, was drifting far off course despite having been properly initialized before takeoff. This level of system penetration suggests something more sophisticated than simple jamming, Sarah said, her mind working through the technical possibilities. Someone would need detailed knowledge of Boeing 777 systems architecture to cause this kind of coordinated failure. They're not just blocking signals, they're feeding false information into your systems in a way that's designed to create maximum confusion and disable your ability to navigate or communicate. First Officer Chen looked up from her checklist with an expression of growing alarm. If that's true, then whoever is doing this knows exactly what aircraft we're flying and possibly even our specific tail number and system configurations. This isn't random, it's a targeted attack on this particular flight. The implications were staggering. A targeted cyber attack on a commercial airliner over the Pacific Ocean suggested either state-level resources or an incredibly sophisticated criminal organization. More immediately concerning, it meant that their problems were unlikely to resolve themselves naturally. Someone was actively working to disable their aircraft, and the situation would probably continue to deteriorate until the attackers achieved whatever their objective might be. Captain Rodriguez was trying to maintain level flight using only the standby instruments and his decades of experience, but the task was becoming increasingly difficult as more systems began to fail. The autopilot had disconnected itself an hour ago when the conflicting sensor inputs became too severe for the computer to reconcile. The flight management system was now displaying nothing but error codes, and even the basic attitude and altitude indicators were showing subtle but persistent input. We need to try to establish some kind of communication with the outside world, Sarah said, thinking through their options. Even if the main radio systems are compromised, there might be other ways to get a message. Do you have any portable emergency radio equipment, or could we potentially use passenger cell phones if we descended to a lower altitude? Jennifer, the senior flight attendant, spoke up from her position near the cockpit door. We have emergency locator beacons, but they're designed to activate only after a crash. There are also some portable radio units in the emergency equipment, but I'm not sure they have the range to reach anyone from our current position. Dr. Harrison was studying the flight progress chart, trying to estimate their position using dead reckoning techniques that hadn't been necessary for commercial aviation in decades. Based on our departure time, heading, and airspeed, we should be roughly 800 miles west of the California coast. That puts us well beyond the range of most emergency radio systems, but we might be able to reach a military installation if we can get any radio working. Sarah found herself thinking about the passengers in the cabin behind them, most of whom were probably unaware of the true severity of their situation. As a teacher, she was accustomed to being responsible for the safety and well-being of large groups of people, but never in circumstances like these. The physics principles she taught every day were now literally matters of life and death for everyone aboard the aircraft. The engine instruments were beginning to show concerning trends. Fuel flow rates were higher than normal, suggesting that the engines were working harder to maintain their current flight profile. More worryingly, the fuel quantity indicators were giving readings that didn't match the calculated consumption since takeoff. If the fuel management system had been compromised, they might not have accurate information about how much flying time remained. We need to start thinking about contingency plans, Captain Rodriguez said,
his voice heavy with the weight of command responsibility. "If we can't re-establish communication or fix our navigation systems, we're going to have to make some very difficult decisions about how to proceed. We have enough fuel for perhaps 3 more hours of flight, but without reliable navigation, we could be flying away from land rather than toward it." The aircraft shuddered slightly as a gust of turbulence hit them, a reminder of the physical forces at work even as they dealt with the electronic warfare being waged against their systems. Sarah gripped the edge of the console to steady herself and found her mind automatically calculating the aerodynamic stresses involved. The airplane was still flying normally from a basic physics standpoint. Lift was still greater than weight, thrust was still overcoming drag, but the systems that allowed the pilots to control and navigate that flight were being systematically destroyed. What if we could somehow isolate the affected systems and revert to completely manual flight? Sarah asked, thinking out loud. If this is a cyber attack, it's probably targeting the integrated computer systems, but the basic flight controls should still be mechanical or hydraulic, right? First Officer Chen nodded thoughtfully. The primary flight controls are hydraulically powered with manual backup, but most of our navigation and communication systems are integrated through the flight management computer. Isolating the affected systems might protect
what's left, but it would also mean giving up any chance of recovering normal operations. The decision to attempt a complete system isolation was not taken lightly. Captain Rodriguez gathered everyone in the cramped cockpit space for what amounted to an emergency war council. Outside the small windows, the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, a blue void that offered no landmarks or references for navigation. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, which provided at least one reliable directional reference, but also reminded them that they were racing against time and approaching the limits of their fuel reserves. Sarah found herself taking the lead in explaining the technical rationale for their plan. Based on what we're seeing, the attack appears to be propagating through the aircraft's integrated computer networks, she explained to the group. If we can identify and physically disconnect the compromised systems, we might be able to protect the essential flight controls and prevent further degradation. Harrison was nodding in agreement, his air traffic control experience providing valuable perspective on what ground-based systems might still be functional. Even if civilian air traffic control has lost contact with us, military radar installations along the west coast should still be tracking an unidentified aircraft in their airspace. If we can get close enough to land and establish any kind of communication, help will be available. The challenge was determining which systems could be safely disconnected without compromising the aircraft's basic flyability. Captain Rodriguez and First Officer Chen had training in flying with degraded systems, but complete manual navigation over oceanic distances was beyond anything they had practiced in their careers. They would essentially be reverting to navigation techniques used by pilots in the 1940s, combined with the aerodynamic capabilities of a modern airliner. Jennifer reported that the passenger cabin was becoming increasingly restless as the unusual flight patterns and extended emergency procedures continued. Passengers were asking pointed questions about their destination and timeline, and several had noticed that their personal GPS devices and cell phones were showing no signal or strange location readings. The flight attendants were doing their best to maintain calm, but the situation was becoming difficult to manage with vague reassurances. "We need to give the passengers some information," Sarah said, thinking about crisis communication principles she had learned during her teacher training. People handle uncertainty better when they understand what's happening and what's being done to address it. Right now, they're imagining scenarios that might be worse than reality. Captain Rodriguez was reluctant to reveal the full extent of their situation, fearing panic that could make an already dangerous situation unmanageable. However, he acknowledged that some level of honest communication would be necessary, especially if they needed to prepare passengers for emergency landing procedures or potential ditching in the ocean. The technical work of isolating systems began with Sarah and First Officer Chen carefully examining the aircraft's electrical panel. Using her understanding of electromagnetic principles and Chen's detailed knowledge of the Boeing 777's architecture, they identified circuits that could be safely disconnected to create electronic isolation barriers. The goal was to create a firewall that would prevent the cyber attack from spreading to critical flight control systems. Here Sarah said, pointing to a section of circuit breakers. These control the connections between the flight management computer and the basic autopilot systems. If we pull these, we lose automatic navigation but preserve manual flight control. Chen hesitated for a moment. Pulling circuit breakers during flight went against every instinct developed through years of training, but the circumstances were clearly beyond normal procedures. As they worked, Dr. Harrison was attempting to calculate their approximate position using dead reckoning techniques. He had found a manual compass in the emergency equipment that seemed to be unaffected by the electronic interference, and was using their known departure time, heading, and estimated airspeed to plot their probable location on a paper chart. The calculations suggested they were still roughly 600 miles from the near and well beyond the range of emergency radio equipment but potentially within range of military radar systems. The first sign that their isolation efforts might be working came when the attitude indicator stopped their erratic behavior and began providing consistent readings. Captain Rodriguez was able to level the aircraft more precisely and establish a steady heading toward what they hoped was the direction of the California coast. The fuel quantity indicators were still unreliable, but the engine instruments were showing more stable readings. Sarah was monitoring the communication systems, hoping that isolating some circuits might restore radio functionality. She had studied electromagnetic interference during her graduate work and understood that sophisticated jamming systems often relied on feedback loops through the target system's own electronics. By breaking those loops, they might be able to create windows of communication opportunity. "Try the radio now," she suggested to First Officer Chen. Chen activated the VHF radio and began broadcasting on the standard emergency frequency, "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is United Flight 847, approximately 600 miles west of California coast. We have experienced total communication and navigation failure due to suspected cyber attack. Requesting immediate assistance and vector to nearest suitable airport." For several seconds there was only static. Then faintly but clearly, a response came through, "Aircraft calling Mayday, this is Edwards Air Force Base. We have you on radar as an unidentified target. Confirm your identity and situation." The relief in the cockpit was palpable. They had re-established contact with the outside world. Dr. Harrison immediately took over the radio communications, his experience and knowledge of air traffic control procedures allowing him to quickly convey their situation to the military controllers. Within minutes, they had established a communication link that, while intermittent and subject to interference, provided their first reliable connection to ground-based assistance since the crisis began. The military controllers at Edwards Air Force Base confirmed that they had been tracking an unidentified aircraft for the past 2 hours, an aircraft that had disappeared from civilian radar systems but remained visible on military tracking equipment. More importantly, they reported that several other commercial flights in the Pacific region had reported similar but less severe electronic interference, suggesting a coordinated attack on civilian aviation systems. The radio contact with Edwards Air Force Base transformed their desperate situation into a coordinated emergency response, but it also revealed the true scope of what they were facing. The military controllers reported that at least 6 other commercial aircraft in the Pacific region had experienced varying degrees of electronic interference, though none as severe as Flight 847. The pattern suggested a systematic attack on civilian aviation infrastructure that was still ongoing. Major Susan Phillips, the air traffic controller at Edwards, quickly became their lifeline to the outside world. Her calm professional demeanor and detailed knowledge of emergency procedures provided exactly the kind of ground-based support that Captain Rodriguez needed to navigate their crisis. "Flight 847, we have you on radar, bearing 270 degrees, distance approximately 400 miles from Los Angeles International Airport. We're coordinating with civilian authorities to clear priority routing for your emergency landing." Sarah found herself fascinated by the coordination taking place between military and civilian authorities. Within minutes of establishing radio contact, Edwards Air Force Base had contacted the Federal Aviation Administration, the Department of Homeland Security, and the airline's Operations Center. The response demonstrated the robust emergency procedures that existed for exactly this type of unprecedented situation, even though no one had ever dealt with a cyber attack of this sophistication. The fuel situation was becoming critical. First Officer Chen's calculations, based on the engine performance data they could still trust, suggested they had perhaps 90 minutes of flying time remaining. The electronic interference had affected the fuel management system's ability to provide accurate quantity readings, but the basic physics of fuel consumption couldn't be fooled. They were burning aviation fuel at a known rate, and simple arithmetic dictated their remaining options. Dr. Harrison was working with Major Phillips to establish the most direct route to Los Angeles International Airport, but even the shortest path would require careful fuel management. "We need to begin an immediate descent to optimize our fuel consumption," he advised Captain Rodriguez. "Every minute we spend at this altitude costs us fuel we can't afford to waste." The descent presented new challenges as they moved into increasingly crowded airspace. The Los Angeles basin was one of the busiest aviation regions in the world, with multiple airports handling hundreds of flights per day. Major Phillips was coordinating with civilian air traffic control to clear a priority corridor for Flight 847, but the process was complicated by their unreliable communication systems and the ongoing electronic interference. Sarah was monitoring the aircraft systems, looking for any signs that the cyber attack was evolving or intensifying. The isolation measures they had implemented seemed to be holding, but she noticed periodic spikes in electromagnetic interference that suggested their attackers were still actively trying to penetrate the aircraft's defenses. "It's like they're probing for vulnerabilities," she explained to the others. "Every few minutes there's a surge of activity across multiple frequency bands." The passenger cabin was becoming increasingly tense as the extended emergency procedures continued without clear explanation. Jennifer reported that several passengers had noticed the military fighter jets that had appeared alongside their aircraft, a standard escort procedure for aircraft experiencing communication difficulties, but alarming to civilians who weren't familiar with such protocols. The sight of armed military aircraft was raising questions that were becoming difficult to deflect with vague reassurances. Captain Rodriguez made the decision to provide passengers with a more detailed explanation of their situation. Over the intercom, he explained that they had experienced sophisticated electronic interference that had affected their communication and navigation systems, but that they had re-established contact with ground control and were proceeding to Los Angeles for an emergency landing. He emphasized that the aircraft was flying normally, and that the situation, while serious, was under control. The announcement had mixed results. Some passengers were relieved to finally understand what was happening, and why their flight was taking longer than scheduled. Others were frightened by the revelation that they had been the target of what amounted to an electronic attack. Parents tried to reassure children while dealing with their own anxiety about the implications of being targeted by unknown attackers with sophisticated capabilities. As they descended through 20,000 feet, the communication situation improved dramatically. The lower altitude brought them within range of multiple civilian air traffic control facilities, and the reduced distance seemed to overcome much of the electronic interference. Major Phillips coordinated their handoff to Los Angeles Approach Control, who immediately cleared all other traffic from their intended flight path. Flight 847, Los Angeles Approach Control. We have you on radar and have cleared priority routing direct to LA. Emergency equipment is standing by, and we have investigators from multiple agencies waiting to begin analysis of what you've experienced. How are your flight controls and landing systems? The question highlighted their next major challenge. While they had successfully isolated many systems to prevent further cyber penetration, they weren't certain which systems would be available for landing. The instrument landing system that normally guided aircraft to safe touchdowns relied on many of the same electronic systems that had been compromised. Captain Rodriguez would likely need to perform a manual landing using only basic instruments and visual references. Sarah was studying the approach charts for Los Angeles International Airport, trying to identify backup procedures that would allow them to land safely with minimal electronic assistance. Her physics background was proving valuable in calculating approach angles and descent rates that would work without computer assistance. LAX has multiple long runways oriented in different directions, she pointed out. If we can get visual contact with the airport, the physics of a manual approach should be manageable. Dr. Harrison was coordinating with approach control to ensure that emergency services would be positioned appropriately for their arrival. Fire and rescue equipment, medical personnel, and law enforcement were all being staged at LAX in preparation for what authorities were treating as a potential terrorism incident. The passengers would likely face extensive interviews and investigation once they landed, but first they had to complete the most challenging part of their ordeal, getting safely on the ground. The Los Angeles basin spread out below them like a vast carpet of lights as Flight 847 descended through 10,000 feet in the gathering dusk. What should have been a routine approach to one of the world's busiest airports had become a complex emergency operation involving multiple agencies and unprecedented coordination between military and civilian authorities. Sarah could see the distinctive pattern of runway lights at LAX in the distance, a reassuring sight that represented safety and the end of their airborne ordeal. Captain Rodriguez was hand-flying the aircraft with a skill that demonstrated decades of experience, but the strain was visible in his focused concentration and the tension in his shoulders. Without the automated systems that normally assisted with approach and landing procedures, he was relying on fundamental flying skills and the basic physics of aircraft control. Every input had to be precise, every adjustment carefully calculated to maintain the proper descent rate and approach angle. The radio chatter between Flight 847 and Los Angeles approach control had intensified as they entered the terminal area. Air traffic controllers were coordinating with multiple agencies while simultaneously clearing the airspace around LAX of all other traffic. Flight 847, you are cleared for visual approach runway 24 left. Emergency equipment is in position and you have priority handling. Wind is light and variable. Visibility 10 miles. Sarah was serving as an unofficial flight engineer, monitoring the systems they still trusted and calling out altitude and airspeed readings to help Captain Rodriguez maintain proper approach parameters. Her physics training was proving invaluable in calculating the aircraft's energy state and predicting how adjustments to power and pitch would affect their flight path. Altitude 8,000 feet, airspeed 210 knots. Descent rate 800 feet per minute, she called out. Dr. Harrison maintained communication with approach control while First Officer Chen focused on the landing checklist. The challenge was determining which automated systems could be safely used and which might still be compromised by the cyber attack. The landing gear extension was a mechanical system that should be unaffected, but the wheel and brake sensors relied on electronics that might provide false readings. The passenger cabin was silent with tension as people sensed that they were approaching a critical phase of their emergency. Jennifer and the other flight attendants had briefed everyone on emergency landing procedures, though they had been careful not to suggest that a crash was likely. Most passengers could see the airport lights ahead and understood that they were finally approaching their destination, but the presence of emergency vehicles visible on the ground reminded everyone that their situation remained serious. Landing gear down and locked, First Officer Chen reported, confirming that the mechanical backup indicators showed proper gear extension despite conflicting electronic readings. The aircraft's behavior felt normal as Captain Rodriguez reduced power and adjusted the flaps for landing configuration. The basic aerodynamics of the Boeing 777 were unchanged by the electronic interference. The wings still generated lift, the control surfaces still responded to input, and the engines still provided thrust. Major Phillips at Edwards Air Force Base was monitoring their progress and coordinating with federal investigators who were already working to trace the source of the cyber attack. Flight 847, preliminary analysis suggests the attack originated from multiple coordinated sources, possibly including satellite-based systems. You may have been the target of a state-sponsored operation or highly sophisticated criminal organization. The revelation that they had been targeted by what might be a foreign government or major criminal enterprise added another layer of complexity to their situation. As they approached the runway, Sarah realized that their ordeal might not end with landing.
The passengers and crew of Flight 847 had become witnesses to an unprecedented attack on civilian aviation, and they would likely face extensive debriefing and investigation in the coming days and weeks. Altitude 3,000 feet, airspeed 180 knots, on glide path, Sarah called out as they continued their descent. The runway lights were clearly visible ahead, and Captain Rodriguez was maintaining a stable approach despite the challenging circumstances. The physics of their situation were straightforward. They needed to reduce their kinetic energy gradually while maintaining enough lift to prevent stalling, then transition to ground contact at a safe speed. Los Angeles Approach Control was providing continuous updates on wind conditions and runway status. Flight 847, wind now calm, runway 24 left is clear and available, emergency equipment standing by. You are cleared to land. The controller's voice carried a note of tension despite the professional delivery, reflecting the unprecedented nature of the situation unfolding in one of the world's busiest airspaces. The aircraft passed through 1,000 feet altitude with stable flight parameters. Captain Rodriguez was making small adjustments to power and pitch, maintaining the proper approach angle through skill and experience rather than automated guidance. Sarah could feel the slight changes in G-force as the captain made corrections, the physics of flight control playing out in real time through the aircraft's response to control inputs. 500 feet, airspeed 160 knots, looking good, Sarah reported. The runway was rushing up to meet them, the white centerline lights providing visual guidance for what would be an entirely manual touchdown. In the cabin behind them, passengers gripped armrests and held their breath as they realized that the next few seconds would determine whether their terrifying flight would end safely or in disaster. Captain Rodriguez pulled back slightly on the controls as they crossed the runway threshold, reducing their descent rate and preparing for touchdown. The physics of landing required careful energy management. Too much speed would result in a long rollout or possible runway overrun. Too little speed risked a hard landing or loss of control. After hours of fighting electronic interference and system failures, success would ultimately depend on the fundamental relationship between lift, weight, thrust, and drag that governed all flight.
The main landing gear touched the runway with a solid thump that sent a collective sigh of relief through the passenger cabin. Captain Rodriguez deployed the thrust reversers and applied brakes, bringing the Boeing 777 to a controlled stop well before the end of the 10,000-foot runway. As the aircraft came to rest, applause erupted from the passengers, a spontaneous celebration of survival that acknowledged the skill and courage of everyone who had contributed to bringing them safely to the ground. Sarah felt her hands shaking as the adrenaline that had sustained her through the crisis began to subside. The physics teacher who had boarded the flight for a relaxing vacation had spent the last 4 hours serving as an improvised systems engineer and navigator, applying theoretical knowledge in circumstances she had never imagined. The successful landing validated not only her technical understanding but also the power of fundamental scientific principles when human expertise was properly applied. Emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft within seconds of their arrival at the gate. Fire trucks, ambulances, and law enforcement vehicles created a perimeter around Flight 847, while federal investigators and aviation officials prepared to begin what would undoubtedly be one of the most complex incident investigations in commercial aviation history. The passengers would be interviewed extensively, but first, medical personnel needed to ensure that everyone had survived the ordeal without physical or psychological harm. Dr. Harrison was already in communication with FBI cybersecurity specialists who had been monitoring the incident from Washington, D.C. The cyber attack on Flight 847 represented a new category of threat to civilian aviation, one that demonstrated sophisticated knowledge of aircraft systems and the ability to coordinate complex electronic warfare operations. The investigation would likely take months and involve multiple international agencies. Captain Rodriguez gathered the ad hoc crisis team in the cockpit for a brief debrief before the investigators took over. "I want to thank each of you for your contributions under extraordinary circumstances," he said, his voice heavy with emotion and exhaustion. "Dr. Mitchell, your technical knowledge and analytical thinking were essential to our survival. Dr. Harrison, your air traffic control experience provided the bridge we needed to re-establish communication. We couldn't have made it without the teamwork we developed up here. Sarah found herself thinking about her students back in Portland. The crisis had demonstrated the real-world relevance of the physics principles she taught every day, but more importantly, it had shown how technical knowledge combined with clear thinking and teamwork could solve problems that seemed impossible. She realized that this experience would fundamentally change how she approached teaching, giving her concrete examples of how scientific understanding could be applied in life-or-death situations. The deplaning process was carefully managed by federal authorities. Each passenger was escorted off the airfield individually and taken to a secure area of the terminal where FBI agents and aviation investigators conducted preliminary interviews. The process would take hours, but authorities needed to gather information about the passengers' observations while their memories were still fresh. Several passengers had noticed unusual electronic behavior with their personal devices that might provide clues about the attack's methodology. As Sarah waited her turn to be interviewed, she reflected on the broader implications of what they had experienced. If sophisticated cyber attacks could disable the electronic systems of commercial aircraft, the entire aviation industry would need to rethink its approach to cybersecurity. The increasing integration of aircraft systems with ground-based networks and satellite communications had created vulnerabilities that malicious actors could exploit with devastating consequences. Jennifer, the senior flight attendant, approached Sarah in the waiting area. The investigators want to speak with you separately because of your technical role in resolving the crisis, she explained. They've set up a special debriefing room with aviation experts and cybersecurity specialists. Your insights into what happened up there could be crucial for preventing similar attacks in the future. The special debriefing session lasted 3 hours and involved experts from the FAA, FBI, Department of Homeland Security, and Boeing. Sarah found herself explaining electromagnetic theory and aircraft systems architecture to investigators who were trying to understand how the attack had been carried out and how similar incidents could be prevented. Her unique combination of physics knowledge and first-hand experience with the crisis made her perspective particularly valuable. The preliminary investigation revealed that the attack had indeed been unprecedented in its sophistication and coordination. Multiple sources had simultaneously targeted different aspects of Flight 847's electronic systems, using techniques that suggested either state-sponsored capabilities or access to classified technical information about Boeing 777 vulnerabilities. The attackers had demonstrated knowledge of specific aircraft systems that should have been highly restricted information. During the debriefing, Sarah learned that her quick thinking in isolating compromised systems had likely prevented the attack from spreading to critical flight control computers. The firewall approach she had suggested, based on her understanding of electromagnetic interference patterns, had protected essential systems long enough for them to re-establish communication and navigate to safety. Her actions had essentially saved the flight by applying academic knowledge in a practical crisis situation. The media response was immediate and intense. By morning, news outlets around the world were reporting on the cyber attack crisis at 35,000 feet and the teacher who helped save Flight 847. Sarah found herself reluctantly thrust into the spotlight as a symbol of how ordinary citizens could rise to extraordinary challenges when their knowledge and skills were needed. The story resonated with people who understood that heroes weren't always trained professionals but sometimes ordinary people who stepped forward when circumstances demanded it. The investigation would continue for months, but the immediate priority was implementing emergency cybersecurity measures across the aviation industry. The attack on Flight 847 had exposed vulnerabilities that affected thousands of aircraft worldwide, and airlines needed to act quickly to protect their passengers and crews from similar threats. The weeks following the Flight 847 incident transformed Sarah's life in ways she never could have anticipated. What had begun as a desperate attempt to help during an aviation crisis evolved into her becoming a key witness in one of the most significant cybersecurity investigations in U.S. Federal investigators had determined that the attack represented a new category of threat that combined sophisticated technical capabilities with unprecedented knowledge of commercial aviation systems. The FBI's Cyber Division established a task force specifically dedicated to the Flight 847 investigation, bringing together experts from multiple agencies, including the CIA, Department of Homeland Security, and international partners. Sarah found herself repeatedly called to Washington, D.C., to provide technical testimony and help investigators understand the sequence of system failures that had nearly brought down the aircraft. Her unique perspective as both a victim and a technical expert made her invaluable to the investigation. Director James Walsh of the FBI's Cyber Division explained to Sarah during one of her briefings that the attack had demonstrated capabilities that suggested either a nation-state actor or a criminal organization with access to classified information. The level of technical sophistication and the specific knowledge of Boeing 777 vulnerabilities indicates that whoever did this had inside information about aircraft systems that should have been highly restricted, he explained. The investigation revealed that the attack had been conducted using a combination of satellite-based jamming, sophisticated software infiltration, and coordinated electromagnetic interference. The attackers had somehow gained access to technical specifications for the Boeing 777's integrated computer systems and had developed custom malware, designed specifically to target those systems. The precision of the attack suggested months or years of preparation and access to resources that few organizations possessed. Sarah's analysis of the electromagnetic interference patterns had provided crucial evidence about the attack's methodology. Her physics background allowed her to identify specific frequency signatures and interference techniques that helped investigators trace the attack to its sources. The electromagnetic fingerprints she had documented during the crisis became key evidence in establishing the attack's origin and the sophisticated equipment used to carry it out. The international implications of the investigation were staggering. Preliminary evidence suggested that the attack had originated from multiple countries simultaneously, using satellite networks and ground-based facilities coordinated across different time zones. This level of international coordination pointed to either a state-sponsored operation or a criminal organization with global reach and significant technical resources. Dr. Harrison had also become a key figure in the investigation, his air traffic control experience providing crucial insights into how the attack had affected ground-based aviation systems. The investigators discovered that the attackers had not only targeted Flight 847 specifically but had also attempted to penetrate air traffic control networks along the West Coast. Only the isolation measures that Sarah had suggested had prevented the attack from spreading to ground-based systems that controlled hundreds of other aircraft. The aviation industry response was swift and comprehensive. Boeing issued emergency service bulletins for all 777 operators worldwide, recommending immediate cybersecurity upgrades and new protocols for dealing with electronic interference. The FAA implemented emergency regulations requiring enhanced cybersecurity measures for all commercial aircraft operating in U.S. airspace. Airlines worldwide began reviewing their electronic systems and implementing additional security measures to prevent similar attacks. Sarah found herself becoming an inadvertent expert on aviation cybersecurity, consulted by airlines, aircraft manufacturers, and government agencies seeking to understand the vulnerabilities that had been exploited. Her academic background in physics, combined with her first-hand experience of the attack, made her uniquely qualified to bridge the gap between theoretical cybersecurity concepts and practical aviation safety measures. The psychological impact on the passengers and crew of Flight 847 was significant and long-lasting. Many passengers reported ongoing anxiety about flying, concerned that they might again become targets of sophisticated attacks. The crew members, particularly Captain Rodriguez and First Officer Chen, underwent extensive psychological evaluation and support to help them process the trauma of commanding an aircraft under attack by unknown enemies with advanced capabilities. Media attention continued to focus on Sarah's role in the crisis, with news outlets describing her as the teacher who saved Flight 847 inches and highlighting how her academic knowledge had been applied in a life-or-death situation. Education advocates used her story to argue for increased funding for science education, pointing out how theoretical physics knowledge had proven essential in a practical emergency. Sarah found herself reluctantly thrust into the role of spokesperson for the importance of STEM education. The investigation also revealed disturbing intelligence about other planned attacks on civilian aviation. The Flight 847 incident had apparently been a test case for techniques that the attackers planned to use against multiple aircraft simultaneously. The coordination and sophistication of the attack suggested that it was part of a larger campaign targeting civilian transportation infrastructure, possibly as preparation for a more devastating coordinated assault. International cooperation in the investigation expanded to include agencies from allied nations whose aviation systems had been probed by similar techniques. The attack on Flight 847 was revealed to be part of a broader pattern of testing and reconnaissance targeting commercial aviation systems worldwide. The implications for global aviation security were profound, requiring unprecedented coordination between nations to address the threat. Sarah's testimony before congressional committees investigating aviation cybersecurity helped lawmakers understand the technical aspects of the threat and the need for enhanced security measures. Her ability to explain complex electromagnetic and computer system concepts in terms that non-technical audiences could understand made her an effective advocate for increased cybersecurity funding and research. 6 months after Flight 847, Sarah Mitchell stood before a classroom at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C., addressing a gathering of aviation security experts, military personnel, and international. The woman who had boarded a flight to Hawaii for a simple vacation had become one of the world's leading authorities on aviation cybersecurity, her experience during the crisis having opened doors to opportunities she had never imagined. The investigation into the Flight 847 attack had concluded with the identification of a While the full scope of the conspiracy remained classified, authorities had successfully disrupted the network and prevented the planned follow-up attacks that could have brought down dozens of aircraft simultaneously. Sarah's technical analysis had been instrumental in tracing the attack methods and identifying the electronic signatures that led to the perpetrators. Her new role as a consultant for the Department of Homeland Security allowed her to apply her physics knowledge and crisis experience to help protect the nation's aviation infrastructure. She had developed new protocols for detecting and responding to cyber attacks on aircraft systems, training programs for pilots and air traffic controllers, and educational materials that helped aviation professionals understand the electromagnetic and computer science principles underlying modern cyber threats. The personal relationships forged during the crisis had evolved into lasting friendships and professional collaboration. Dr. Gibson had become a mentor and colleague, his air traffic control experience complementing her technical knowledge as they worked together on aviation security projects. Captain Rodriguez and First Officer Chen remained in contact. Their shared experience having created bonds that transcended the typical relationships between airline crew members and passengers. The Boeing 777 that had carried them through their ordeal had been extensively modified and now served as a test bed for new cybersecurity systems. The aircraft's manufacturers had implemented hundreds of design changes based on lessons learned from the attack, creating new generations of aircraft with enhanced protection against electronic warfare. Sarah often visited the aircraft during testing phases, its familiar interior serving as a reminder of how far aviation security had advanced since that terrifying day over the Pacific. Her students back in Portland had followed her journey with pride and excitement, seeing their physics teacher become a national figure in cybersecurity and aviation safety. Sarah continued to teach part-time, finding that her real-world experience had transformed her approach to education. Physics principles that had once seemed abstract and theoretical now carried the weight of life and death implications, making her classes more engaging and relevant than ever before. The broader implications of the Flight 847 incident continued to resonate throughout the aviation industry and beyond. The attack had demonstrated that civilian infrastructure was vulnerable to sophisticated cyber warfare techniques, leading to enhanced security measures, not just for aviation, but for all forms of transport, power grids, and communication networks. Sarah's experience had become a case study in how academic knowledge could be applied to address unprecedented security challenges. International cooperation in cybersecurity had strengthened significantly in response to the threat revealed by the Flight 847 attack.
Sarah found herself participating in conferences and training programs around the world, sharing her experience and helping other nations develop their own capabilities for detecting and responding to cyber attacks on critical infrastructure. Her story had become a symbol of how ordinary citizens could make extraordinary contributions when their knowledge and skills were needed. The psychological impact of the experience had also led Sarah to advocacy work supporting other survivors of technological attacks and aviation incidents. She had helped establish support networks for passengers and crew members who had experienced similar traumas, recognizing that the emotional aftermath of such incidents required attention alongside the technical and security responses. As she concluded her presentation at the National Defense University, Sarah reflected on the unexpected path her life had taken. The physics teacher who had boarded a flight for a vacation had become a cybersecurity expert, a government consultant, and an international advocate for aviation safety. The experience had demonstrated that expertise could emerge from unexpected sources, and that academic knowledge, when combined with clear thinking and courage, could address challenges that seemed impossible. The questions from her audience reflected the ongoing nature of the threats facing modern aviation and the continued need for innovative approaches to cybersecurity. Sarah's responses drew on both her technical knowledge and her first-hand experience of how systems could fail and be restored under extreme pressure. Her story had become more than just an account of survival. It was a blueprint for how society could respond to emerging technological threats through collaboration, expertise, and determination. Looking toward the future, Sarah knew that the threats to aviation and other critical infrastructure would continue to evolve, requiring constant vigilance and adaptation. But she also knew that the lessons learned from Flight 847, the importance of understanding fundamental principles, the value of diverse expertise, and the power of teamwork under pressure, would remain relevant regardless of what new challenges emerged. The teacher who had become an air traffic controller at 45,000 feet had found her true calling in protecting others from similar experiences, ensuring that the skies would remain safe for future generations of travelers. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.